this year, one of my top goals is to finally finish reading the whole Bible. I have read through several books already, but I'm just going through reading every single one, and I really wanted to read along with you guys. So this video is going to be all about the first 5 books in the Bible. I want this video to be a helpful tool, help you understand what you're reading more, because the Old Testament has some very complex topics that they talk about. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to be going off of is from the Bible Handbook by the Daily Grace Co. This has been the most helpful tool for me reading the whole entire Bible, and there is so much helpful information in here. I have several pages of notes that I'm going to be reading over with y'all today. At the beginning of every book I'm going to be going over in this video, I will put up a picture of an outline that you can follow, just so you can have some help on how to split these books up and read it in portions and sections. Before we get into Genesis, I wanted to give a little bit of a background. So like I said, the first 5 books consist of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I also mentioned that they're called the Torah, the Law, or the Pentateuch. The Torah is the Jewish term for teaching. The Law is referring to the Law of Moses, and the Pentateuch simply means 5 books. All of these books fit into the historical narrative genre of the Bible. Big chunk of the Old Testament is historical narrative. It's important because it makes up a huge portion of our Bible. There's a huge portion in the Old Testament, and then part of the Gospels in the New Testament are also part of the historical narrative genre, and it shows us the entire foundation of our faith. There are some very complex stories, but there's a lot of like underlying meanings to it. The Bible also falls into 4 major movements: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Creation and the fall happens in Genesis. As you know, the creation of the world and then the fall of man happens shortly after in Genesis chapter 3, where the serpent convinces Adam and Eve to eat from the forbidden tree. They eat from it, they disobey the Lord, and sin enters the world. Then redemption comes in through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and then restoration will come when Christ returns again. So Genesis is, like I said, a law book, and it fits into the historical narrative genre of the Old Testament, and it was written by Moses. Now I just want to kind of summarize each of the sections in Genesis just so you can kind of get a better understanding. In Genesis chapters 1 through 2, obviously it's all about creation of the universe, the earth, the moon, the stars. Man was created in God's image. There's a term for this, it's called Imago Dei. Then in chapter 3 we read about the fall, where the serpent convinces Adam and Eve to eat from the forbidden tree. They do it, they disobey the Lord, sin enters the world, and God is no longer able to dwell with us because he is holy and pure and we are sinful in nature. And then in chapters 4 through 6, Cain and Abel are introduced. Cain and Abel were both Adam and Eve's first 2 sons, and Cain committed the first murder in the Bible when he killed his brother Abel. And then we jump ahead to chapters 7 through 10 and we read about the famous story of the flood, Noah's Ark. God washed everything from the earth and only saved one man and his family, and that man was Noah. He told Noah to build an ark and that there would be a flood and it would rain for 40 days and 40 nights. So the flood came, Noah built the ark, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, the water prevailed for 150 days. Noah sent out a dove at the very end to make sure that the land was dry and they were able to come out. And then God made a covenant with Noah saying that he would never flood the earth again, and the rainbow became a sign of that covenant. Then we just hear about more rebellion and sin in the world in chapter 11, Tower of Babel. People tried to make a name for themselves by building a tower to heaven. Obviously it didn't work. Their punishment was God scattered them around the world and scattered their languages. In chapter 12 through 25, Abraham was called, and the narrative shifts from God and the world to God and his relationship with Abraham. He creates a covenant with Abraham called the Abrahamic Covenant. He tells Abraham that he's going to make a great nation. He will be blessed and his descendants would inherit the promised land. And then circumcision became a sign of that covenant. It's a physical reminder that God will be faithful to his promises, and that is a big theme throughout the whole Bible that you will see. We read about Sarah and Hagar. Sarah gave her servant Hagar to Abraham because she wasn't able to bear children, and so Hagar bore a son and called him Ishmael. And then in chapter 17, God changes Sarah's name to Sarah and tells her she will bear a son and name him Isaac. And God tells her that through Isaac he will establish a covenant. Then later God tests Abraham and tells him to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham shows his faith in the Lord, is about to sacrifice his son, and God provides a sacrifice for him. And that's a story that just proves that God will always provide. He'll provide a sacrifice, he'll provide an opportunity, he'll provide in any way if you just have that faith. And Abraham had crazy extreme faith that God would provide that sacrifice in place of his son. So that's a really crazy story to read about. Isaac and Rebekah bore 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob would become Israel, and Jacob had 12 sons who hated the 11th son, Joseph. And this is the famous story of the robe of many colors. They hated their brother Joseph because they were favored by Jacob, and so they sold him into slavery in Egypt. And like I said, that's the story of the robe of many colors. verse if you want to go read that. And then in chapters 37 through 50, Joseph is reunited with his family after they come from the famine. They're saved from the famine, and that is how Genesis ends, with Joseph being reunited with his family. They're saved from the famine. They're in Egypt now. And the key verse of Genesis is Genesis 50:20. It says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So that is the key verse in Genesis, and that is kind of the summary of everything that happens in Genesis. It covers a lot. There's some heavy topics in here, when the first murder is committed and when Abraham is tested to sacrifice his son and God provides. But it's a great story of God's faithfulness and his forgiveness and how he will always provide. And those are all themes that just play on throughout the whole entire Bible. So this is a really important book. It's one of the biggest books of the foundation of our whole entire faith. Obviously talking about, you know, creation and the fall of man. There are some very key and important stories in this first book. Let's move on to Exodus. Exodus is also a law and a historical narrative book. It was written by Moses, and it takes place 400 years after the events in Genesis. Chapters 1 through 4, I wanted to give a little backstory of Moses. He was left in the Nile River in a basket, and he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. Exodus starts off with God's people enslaved by Pharaoh. He raises up Moses through the burning bush and tells him to lead these people, save them from slavery. And then in chapters 5 through 12, we read about the 10 plagues where Moses was going to Pharaoh, asking him to release the Israelites out of slavery. Just kept refusing. His heart was hardened, and God sent the 10 plagues. And one thing that I learned while studying this book is that each of the 10 plagues corresponds with an Egyptian god or goddess, and this displayed that God was the one and only true God. And so in my little book right here, it goes through all of the Egyptian gods and the plagues. So it was very interesting to find that out and just kind of see the symbolism behind that. And then in chapters 13 through 15, Israel is finally freed from slavery, and then the Red Sea parts on their journey, the story of Moses parting the Red Sea with his staff. And then in chapters 16 through 18, we just see God's provision. We see God providing for the Israelites on their journey in miraculous ways. Then in chapters 19 through 24, you read about the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. This is one of the most important Bible verses and stories. The 10 Commandments are, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's house." Then in chapters 25 through 31, we read about the tabernacle blueprint. The tabernacle is the dwelling place, and in this book it also gives you another visual, which is so helpful because I'm like a visual reader. I like to picture it in my head when I'm reading it, and so it's really cool to see what it actually looked like. Then in chapters 32 through 34, Israel abandons the covenant when they make a idol of a golden calf. God still shows his forgiveness, and he renews the covenant with new tablets. I feel like it's a reflection of us today. Like, we still have that sinful nature. Like, we're still so disobedient, but time and time again, God still shows his mercy and his forgiveness. And then finally in chapters 35 through 40, we read about the building of the tabernacle, and it ends with Moses unable to enter the dwelling place. So that is the end of Exodus. Once again, kind of a lot of content and kind of heavy to read about. I think it just shows God's provision and his faithfulness, how he's just able to show forgiveness time and time again. Then we get into Leviticus, which is another law book, and once again fits into the historical narrative genre. It was also written by Moses. It kind of shifts from storytelling to telling of laws and rituals. So like I said, Exodus leaves off with Moses unable to enter the dwelling place, and this shows how significant the rituals are to enter, because God provided a way for us to maintain temporary pureness so we could be in the same place. And in the introduction to Leviticus in my book, it says something that I think is really important and helps you understand it a little bit more. Moses' inability to enter the tabernacle reveals the significance of laws and rituals that follow. God desires to dwell with his people, but their impurity would mean judgment in the presence of a holy God. So that's why there's kind of an emphasis on, you know, a ritual to cleanse yourself before entering the dwelling place, because sin separated people from God in the beginning. When Adam and Eve sinned, they were no longer able to dwell with each other, and through symbolically cleansing, they're able to dwell together in the tabernacle, which is why Moses, before doing the rituals, was unable to enter the dwelling place. So Leviticus can be split into 3 parts: ritual, priesthood, and holiness. Rituals are the instruction of sacrifices, feasts, and holidays. Priesthood includes ordination, qualifications, and functions of priests, and holiness instructs individuals on how to remain holy and pure in their life. So Leviticus is very heavily on instruction and laws, which is why it can be a little bit harder to get through, I think. It shows us God's desire and plan to make a way for sinful people to live in his presence. So chapters 1 through 7 talks about sacrificial laws. There's fellowship offerings, which are for gratitude, and there's burnt offerings, which is forgiveness. And then in chapters 8 through 10 about priesthood laws. In chapters 11 through 15 about holiness laws. Then in chapters 16 through 17 we read about the Day of Atonement, which just anticipates the coming of the all-sufficient sacrifice, Jesus Christ, because this is before Jesus came and died on the cross. In chapters 18 through 20 we read about holiness laws. These are just more laws on the purity of Israel. In chapters 21 through 22 more priesthood laws, how we hold priests to a higher standard. In chapters 23 through 25 feasts and holy days. And in this book it tells you about the feasts in the New Testament image. So Passover symbolizes Jesus's death, unleavened bread symbolizes the burial, the first fruits symbolizes resurrection, and Pentecost symbolizes Holy Spirit. And then the fall feasts are the trumpets, Day of Atonement, and tabernacles, and it's all to be fulfilled in the second advent. And then finally the last chapters in Leviticus, chapters 26 through 27, talk about the covenant. It reiterates God's covenant with Israel. Leviticus tells a beautiful story. It's a story that begins without a way for a man to come before a holy God. But the beginning of Numbers, Moses is able to meet with the Lord because of the system the Lord had put into place. So I hope that kind of helped you understand the rituals more. We're going to move on to Numbers, second to last book in the Torah. It's also a law and historical narrative, and once again, it was written by Moses. Numbers basically covers all of the wandering in the wilderness. It picks up where Moses left off in Exodus on their way to the land God promised them. Chapters 1 through 10 starts off in Sinai in the wilderness. It opens up with a census on how tribes should be arranged by keeping the tabernacle or the dwelling place of the Lord in the center. Also, I forgot to mention in Numbers chapter 6 verse 24 through 26, this is where the blessing comes from. It says, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." And then chapters 11 through 12, all about the wandering in the wilderness. God's presence leads them in a form of a pillar of a cloud by day and a fire by night. Then in chapters 13 through 19, we read about the spies. So 12 spies were sent into the land of Canaan to come back completely hopeful and faithful in this new promised land. But 10 of them, or the majority, come back doubtful. So the people rebel and God prohibits them by living in the promised land. So because of their rebellion and their disobedience, they are now unable to inherit the promised land. So the old generation is left behind to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and the new generation can now receive the inheritance of the land of Canaan. Then in chapters 20 through 21, we read about more wandering. In chapters 20, Moses strikes a rock. It says, "And Moses lifted up his hands and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." So because Moses did not believe in the Lord fully, he was now unable to enter the promised land. In chapters 22 through 36, we read about Moab. Israel travels through Moab. They continue to doubt and rebel, and then God commissions Joshua to replace Moses as a leader of Israel. So that is where Numbers ends. Numbers is kind of a slow book to get through just because there's a lot of wandering, disobedience once again, and it was very interesting for me to read though about how the people were prohibited into entering the promised land, especially Moses. I thought that story was very interesting. So now we're going to get into our last book, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the last book in the law or the Torah, and it's another historical narrative book. It was also written by Moses. It starts off right before the Israelites are about to end their 40-year wandering period, and it's filled with Moses's final teachings. Deuteronomy is a lot of just like reminders summarizing what all has happened so far, and this book summarizes everything really well. Israel has been chosen, set apart by God to be his people. They were enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt for 400 years, but were liberated by God through Moses. The people of Israel entered into a covenant with God. They would be his people and he would be their God, but they quickly rebelled against him over and over again. God made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the Exodus generation had passed. Then their children would be allowed to enter into the land of Canaan, or the promised land. In chapters 1 through 3, Moses remembers the Israelites' story from Exodus until now, which we kind of just went through, how they were enslaved for 400 years, how the Lord saved them from that. In chapters 4 through 11, Moses reminds them of the covenant. They're reminded of the Ten Commandments and the covenant that they have with the Lord. In chapters 12 through 16, Moses reminds them of the laws of worship, how Israel is not to worship any other gods except the one true God. And then in chapters 16 through 18, we read about Israel's leaders. In chapters 19 through 26, laws of society, commands of legal systems, integrity, and families, just how people should operate. A lot of reminders and kind of laws and stuff in this book, which is why we're going through it kind of quickly. Chapters 27 through 30, Moses warns Israel about obedience and disobedience and the difference between a blessing and a curse. Then in chapters 31 through 34, we read about Moses' death. Moses dies because he's not able to inherit the promised land, and Joshua is commissioned as the leader. And that is the end of our Bible study. We covered a lot in this video. I've learned a lot getting to read those first 5 books. There's so much content that is covered in those first 5, but like I said in the beginning, it is so important to understand the historical background of the Bible. Obviously, there's still a big chunk of the historical narrative genre in the Bible after Deuteronomy. I want you all to read that on your own time. The first 5 books are very important because it's the Torah, which is why I wanted to go through it. But read the rest of the historical narrative on your own timeline. And the next Bible study video I'm going to do will be on the Gospels, which is another historical narrative genre chunk in the New Testament this time. But like I said, I really hope you found this video helpful, and I hope we're able to help each other reach our goals of reading the Bible this year. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye!